to go to dinner, and also I know once the people sit down in the seat, we basically have 45 minutes of attention time, and after that, the attention span goes from here to here or here. So I want to make sure I get started. First of all, thank you for coming out here in the middle of the summer. The fact that we continue to have people here shows that despite what other people say, people really do live on Spring Island in the middle of the summer. And we enjoy the fact that it's this size and not 200 people, but don't repeat that. What I wanted to do this evening was to share with you a program that I created when I was asked to do a seminar over at the University of South Carolina at Beaufort. And what's really good is the first time I do a talk, it's usually not that good. So I practiced on them, and I hope it'll be a little bit better with this group here. And tonight what I want to do is I want to tell you 5 bird stories. And these bird stories have something in common, and that is the fact that as humans have lived in North America, they've changed the landscape for the past 300 years. And this is a story not about birds disappearing, but birds adapting and responding to that landscape. And so with that, I also want to share with you how all of us can be involved with bird study. You know, I'm busy doing this day job, and yet I was able to research this topic because of the internet. And so there were 4 tools that I used that I want to make sure you know about in case you happen to be kind of nerdy like me, or you bang up your wrist or some other part, you actually can't play golf or something and are stuck in a chair, or some other thing like that, or the repairman never comes to fix your refrigerator and you're waiting there for a few days. And these tools, first of all, is Google Earth. I'll show you that. The second one is a website called ebird.org. And that's a citizen science-based one that basically I can go to and see what birds were seen yesterday in any part of the world. The third one is the Christmas bird counts. These were started in 1900. 1901 was the first one. They're now sponsored by the Audubon, and if you just type in Christmas bird counts and look for the Audubon site, you'll find a page like this, and you click on this CBC, Christmas bird count results. And what you do is you get this page, and then it walks you through. And I created my own spreadsheets in Excel, and then I was able to map those. And the fourth one is one that's maintained by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's called the Birds of North America. And this is a subscription-based one. I think it's $10 a year, and you have complete access to all the current knowledge that's known about the birds of North America in terms of the literature. And so with that, what I want to do is to start with my first story. And that involves these 2 birds, the RedWinged Blackbird and the snow goose. And I really got involved in birding as a teenager, and all through college I would go out to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And one of the great things I loved to look at there were the snow geese. And so a friend of mine in 2008 said he'd never been to the Outer Banks and had never seen flocks of snow geese. So I said, I've got the place to go. We'll go to the Outer Banks. But when we got there were no snow geese. Now, it had been 30 years since I'd been out there, and I went, hey, I've been hearing snow geese are abundant. What's going on? And I talked to one of the refuge people and said, oh, they don't come here anymore. They go somewhere else. So where do they go? They say, oh, they go inland. So I went to eBird, and I found out that they're over at Pecosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. And so we got in our car and headed over that way, and I used eBird to say exactly where these birds showing up. And I found this map, and it showed it. And one of the interesting things is Phelps Lake is a natural lake. It's a huge Carolina bay. And the birds are seen north and west of Phelps Lake. So I went to Google Earth and said, what the heck's going on? And when you look at Phelps Lake from Google Earth, what you see is what's happened in the last 30 years is large-scale monoculture farming came to eastern North Carolina. Came in there in 1977-78 with First Colony Farms, which later went bankrupt. But this is the landscape that we went to. So we went out there and we started driving around the roads in the National Wildlife Refuge, and there were lots of fields, and we came around a corner, and what we saw was the fact that we encountered a flock of RedWinged Blackbirds. And I don't me just a flock, I could kind of figure out these flocks kind of move along, sort of hopscotch fashion. So I kind of figured out where they're going, and I parked our vehicle there, and we waited. And then what happened is pretty soon, when you looked out the windows of the car, we were surrounded by red-winged blackbirds like this. And I thought, gee, maybe this is an anomaly. But it turns out that the internet is full of pictures of people going to Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and they're all getting pictures of red-winged blackbirds. And so when they looked at it, and I looked at some numbers, by 1975 they estimated 190 million red-winged blackbirds in North America. It's a common bird. And so what's going on with this bird's life cycle? Well, you know, they nest in cattail marshes and other marshes like that. And if you look at their distribution, first of all, here's what the females look like on the right. They have to blend in with the nest. And so you get these flocks of both types. But if you look at the map on the left, what you see is that they're nesting all through Canada, as well as the purple means they're nesting everywhere in the United States. But up north, they have to come south. What they're doing is they're coming down, and because of mechanized agriculture, there's so much grain left in these old cornfields that it is feeding these birds and getting them through the winter that would not have gotten through the winter in the past, that they've gone through a population explosion. And blackbird numbers are huge now. In the 1970s, there was a blackbird roost I used to go out and visit outside Raleigh. It had 1 million birds. And they would all come in at night at this one place. Not a good neighborhood to live in. But the sky would almost get black with them. Now, the snow geese, if you look at their range, things are a little bit different here. They nest up in the tundra. The yellowish is where they migrate, and the blue is where they spend the winter. Notice how they're all through the Mississippi Delta. And one of the things that's been happening with the Mississippi Delta is a lot of rice production. That's where the rice has moved, is up into Arkansas and those areas. So when you look at snow geese, what you find is that snow geese populations have expanded. Here's a flock where somebody, you think you have a boring job? Somebody sat with a pen and counted how many birds. They photographed the flock, and they know that there's 3,355 snow geese. Now I'm going to tell you something. I did not verify that. But when you get to places with snow geese, it's not uncommon. We drive along the fields and we see 5,000, 10,000 snow geese out in the field. And here's an example of 60,000 snow geese in Pennsylvania. So they're surviving, they're getting a lot of food in the winter. What impact does that have? Well, I went to the CDC counts and I said, I want to total the number of birds in the United States to see what was happening. And what I'm doing here is this is number of birds per party hour. In other words, it's the amount of effort. So if there were less people out birding that year, they divided by the number of hours they spent birding. So it tends to standardize things that way. And as you see the red-winged blackbird, 90 is by 1990. That's 2000 is 100. And you can see what's happening. Red-winged blackbirds going along. But look at snow geese. Do you see those numbers? The population is skyrocketing. And why are ecologists interested in that? Because they're all going back up to the tundra. And then when they go back up to the tundra, it turns out all these geese eat grass. And they are denuding the tundra. You see those little fenced-in areas? That's where they kept the snow geese from feeding. That's what that whole tundra used to look like. And so now, think about the other birds that are relying on tundra. So the snow geese, because of mechanized farming in the United States, are changing the landscape up in the tundra. So that's our first story about mechanized farming and big open fields having impacts on the abundance of birds. What I want to do now is I want to take you on a second trip, the second story, and that is that I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. I rode my bicycle a mile this way to elementary school. I rode my bicycle a mile that way to high school. My dad looked at my high school grades. He said, guess what? You're going to ride your bicycle a mile that way to go to NC State. And so when I went to NC State, I needed that my grades were my ticket out of town. So the closest place I applied for grad school and got an assistantship was Texas. But I ended up going to Oregon State because I kept reading the temperatures in Austin, Texas. And so along the way, I was married by that time, and Barbara, unbeknownst to what she was getting into, we were in a pickup truck, covered pickup truck with the mattress in the back and all our belongings underneath. And we headed out, and one of the places I wanted to stop, because I'd heard about birding, was this spot out here. And if you look at the map, this particular place is actually in the Great Basin. So all the water that flows down into that basin never makes it to the ocean, it evaporates. And the place that it flows into is the Great Salt Lake there in Utah. And a lot of it, so I went to Google Earth, and I said, to show you what it looks like, this actually used to be one large lake. You see all the salt flats? That was about 2,000 years ago, that was one giant lake, and there's a little bit left, and that's the Great Salt Lake. The birders, what they're interested in, though, is that there is a place where the water comes down from the Wyoming mountains into the upper edge, and it's called Bear River National Wildlife Refuge. This is where most of the farming occurs, but if we zoom in on Google Earth a little bit more, you can see that there's this pattern right where the river meets the upper end of the Great Salt Lake. And as you look at that, these are large impoundments. This is a national wildlife refuge. This is a place that is being managed for birds, originally for ducks and now all sorts of birds. And when you drive in along the dikes, this is what you see. Lots and lots of waterfowl, because there's these huge shallow flats getting the fresh water from the river. And in addition, I saw my first white pelicans there, 1977. And these birds are cooperative feeders. They line up and they're sort of like a swimming net. And they're dipping their bills in at the same time, feeding all the stuff. They nest there, the ducks nest there, there's shorebirds there. And this is a typical western type grassland habitat that's flooded. A lot of Manitoba, northern and North Dakota can look like this with this sort of habitat. What I want you to do is look at this map of the white pelicans distribution. You see that blue area, that's where they nest. This map is from 1995, and notice where they spend the winter. Is that reddish area down there is the non-breeding area, so that they fly from there down to this area. However, so using Google Earth, they typically come down to this area. But something started happening. In the late 1980s, we started seeing white pelicans show up along the coast of South Carolina. And you said, wait a minute, pelicans on the coast, where would you find them? And so if we take Google Earth and zoom in to say, what kind of places would these white pelicans go? Apparently they can read signs. Because out west they're found at Bear River National Wildlife Refuge. But when they started coming here, if we zoom in on this area, I want you to look at that little circle. In that circle you don't see much, but if we zoom in further, we start seeing that same pattern we saw out west. We see impoundments. They're now going to Bear River National Wildlife Refuge. They come to Bear Island Wildlife Management Area. And when you go to these impoundments, these are the old rice fields that were created in the 1800s that hold water. And essentially what we have is we have a habitat that's almost identical from a bird's perspective to what you find out in the western United States. And as a result, over the last 100 years, keep in mind that habitat was there during the rice culture. Birds have started, that wandered around, birds move around a lot, started saying, this is good habitat. Instead of wintering on the Gulf, they've started coming to these impoundments. So an avocet, when you look at the range map, used to never have anything in the eastern United States. And then had one dot in South Carolina. And now avocets are found up and down the East Coast where there are national wildlife refuges with impoundments. And so this is a western bird that's now seen regularly in the east. And the other thing we have are white pelicans. And it was exciting to see a few, but when we look at the numbers in South Carolina, you can see they kind of been Bachman. Notice how they're starting to jump up. We have counted on, Tony and I, when we've been out with master naturalists, one time we had a flock of 230 white pelicans together with a master naturalist class. White pelicans regularly spend the winter at that little pond next to the Broad River bridge, and they've been seen on the Great Salt Pond, our Great Salt Pond. So there's a story of how by creating waterfowl impoundments, western birds are now using our area because from a bird's eye perspective, it's like the Gulf Coast. The other thing that's happened, this is story number 3, keep things simple, is the fact that as people come in, they've changed the landscape for cattle, for grazing. And I want you to say what's common in these two pictures. We've got a bird here, and nice grassland habitat. And here, we've got a bird with nice grassland habitat. It's the same species of bird. Those are cattle egrets, and it turns out that cattle egrets are native to Africa. In Audubon's time, they never saw a cattle egret. Nobody ever saw a cattle egret in the New World, North or South America, until 1890. And then a small flock showed up in French Guiana. And if you can't really see it from here, I'm going to point things out with a pointer here. But basically, I'm going to read these dates to you so you can fully appreciate what's been happening. We have very sophisticated pointers. Those laser pointers get sucked up by the TV. Sorry, I can't use that. But if you look at it, right here's 1890. Then in 1937, they got out in the Caribbean. The first cattle egret to be seen in North America was 1954. 1956 was the first one in South Carolina. By 1960, they made it to the Great Lakes. By 1965, the first one showed up on the West Coast. By 1979, they showed up in southern Alaska. And then coming south, by 1977, they made it down to Tierra del Fuego. So these birds are long-distance migrants. They got up in a storm, and they moved on their own. But think about why they were able to spread through North America. It was because that habitat wasn't there in the 1600s. It was all forested. So only by creating an agricultural landscape and providing a few cows to follow around to kick up grasshoppers were they able to now make it in this habitat. So the cattle egrets just illustrate to you that birds are always distributing. Individuals are wandering, flocks are showing up at weird places, and responding to changes in the landscape. So with that, I started to say we have a frozen. Okay, here we go. So now today, what we can see is that cattle egrets have basically spread around the world into tropical and semi-tropical areas wherever people have removed the forest. Now, when we talk about grasslands, one of the stories we hear is the fact that when people suppressed fire, the sizes of the prairies became reduced. It used to be that fire kept prairie open all the way into Ohio and into western Kentucky and into Tennessee. But as fire got reduced, the forest spread westward. Let's look at Google Earth and start looking at this area about how that landscape's changed. Just look at the color patterns. The dark green tells you where forests are today. And you can see there's a lot of dark green on the west side of the Mississippi River. Can you all see that sort of pale stripe down the middle? That's all the swamp forest from the Mississippi. So that's our reference point. But what I want to do is I want to zoom in right where the green meets the brown. And when we start doing that, look what that landscape looks like. Now, 100 years ago, 60 years ago, even 50 years ago, a lot of that farming was not highly mechanized. So there were a lot of hedgerows and habitat between the fields. And so those sorts of conditions promoted habitat for certain kinds of birds. What's interesting, so we expect that in the prairie, but now what I'm going to do is do the same thing in southern Georgia, in central Georgia. Is I went to Google Earth and I said, okay, let's see what's happening here. And if you start zooming in on Georgia, what do you start noticing here? This is all typically was forested, but as we zoom in, heck, from the air that looks like, from a bird's eye view, that looks like Kansas. Wait for Dorothy and the witch to fly by. Even when you go into hilly areas, what I want you to know by Google Earth, you can explore, just sort of zoom around and look, is that you can tell these areas, the places where there are trees probably are the low areas where there's still streams. But there's a lot of open space. So if you're a bird that is looking for grassland habitat, from the air, this is looking fairly interesting. And as a result, there's certain birds that were traditionally prairie birds that have moved eastward. The one up at the top is called the grasshopper sparrow. You see that dark magenta? That's its original distribution. See how that light pink had moved eastward? Grasshopper sparrows were prolific through New England, particularly when they were raising hay for horses. So a grasshopper sparrow was a fairly common bird in Massachusetts and New York during the 19-teens and the 1920s. All right, and they stayed through the 1930s, but then started changing. The dickcissel I don't know if you can see, there's a little dotted line that kind of goes out perimeter. Dicysalis are always dispersing, and they show up. Right now there's a pair that bred in North Carolina this summer, all right, because it was out in the grassland area. So these birds are popping up because of that bird's eye view. One of my favorites that's associated with open habitat is the scissortailed flycatcher. If you've driven through Texas, Oklahoma, and haven't been totally comatose or basically hypnotized by that white line down the road, then you may have noticed the scissortailed flycatchers. And I want you to do is to see the distribution of these birds. And the fact is that they're what? You think of them as Texas, Oklahoma, up in that area. Something happened though, and that is scissortailed flycatcher was seen in South Carolina. And during the breeding season, you expect birds to be seen as they're migrating through. One gets blown off course, no big deal to see one in April, May, or in September. But what was going on here? This is Greenville. If you see Greenville, South Carolina as your reference point there. The first time anybody had ever seen a scissortailed flycatcher in South Carolina at all was 1982. Rudy Menke got a call. He was at the South Carolina Museum at the time, and somebody said they had a scissortailed flycatcher, and he's going, "What have you been drinking?" No. But he went out, he didn't say that, but he thought it and went out there and looked. And then what happened later is Clemson, near it where it was given some land, and it wanted to set up an extension farm. And so it clear-cut an area that had been forested, and did that in 2009. 2 years later, a pair of scissortailed flycatchers showed up there and actually nested there successfully in 2011. And ever since then, there's been a pair of scissortailed flycatchers nesting somewhere in South Carolina in the Greenville to Clemson area. These birds have not read the field guides. There's an issue there. Well, my fourth story I want to tell about is that when I've been talking about grasslands as being something of the West, but there is also a grassland that is native to the Southeast. And this is a picture of it. It's a grassland that comes with trees with it. And these trees are spaced wide enough apart that the sun gets to the ground and you get this sort of grassland like this. This was taken right up the road here at Good Hope Plantation. And this is old growth forest. And it's the story of the longleaf pine. For people that, if you've been through the Master Naturalist or kept up the news, you hear all about the longleaf pine. And I want you to think about this as a savanna. And this is the distribution of longleaf pine. So while we think of it as a forest, when the birds look at that, for some birds, they see that as a grassland. And in particular, there's a bird called a Bachman sparrow. It's named after John James Audubon's good friend who was the Episcopal minister in Charleston. And its range, this particular bird is from a genus of sparrows. There's 4 other species in that genus. They're all found in the Southwest. They're all southwestern grassland desert birds. But this particular species is adapted for same kind of habitat. It nests on the ground, hiding its nest in the grass clumps. But it only does it where there's pines in the southeast. And what I want you to notice is, look at that dotted line up there. When you look back to the records, from the period of 1890 to 1915, Bachman sparrows were regularly seen up through western Pennsylvania and through Ohio. And I kept going, what the heck's going on? So I had to go back to the old literature and read about it. This is where that Birds of North America site by Cornell is good to do. And it turns out, during that period, that was the time when that area got clear cut. It got logged. It had been forest. They cut all the forest, and in its place came back broom sedge grasses with scattered shrubs. And so the Bachman sparrows became migratory, and they would go up into those areas and nest because it was so open. But because eventually with time, what happens with the grassy area? It gets replaced by forest. And so by 1915, the forest had recovered in that area, and the habitat was gone. And so the range of the Bachman sparrow shrunk back south. This explains one thing. The first Bachman sparrow I was ever shown, I didn't even have a driver's license yet. I think I was 15, and some of my mentor birders who were bird nerds in graduate school took me out to the Raleigh-Durham airport. And we saw our first Bachman sparrow at the end of the airport, because at the end of the airport, they had to keep cutting down the trees for the planes. So it was grassland or broom sedge with scattered little pines. And so there was this patch of perfect Bachman sparrow habitat in the middle of the Piedmont, and the sparrows had found it. This bird is a bit of an irritation to me, quite frankly, because we now have ideal habitat on Spring Island, but the damn things won't fly across saltwater. So I can go over to the mainland and hear Bachman sparrows, but I haven't gotten them over here yet, and I'm just guessing it's the saltwater. So if you see me out there with a little box and I'm releasing a few birds, just don't ask questions. We'll see what we can do here. So with that then, when we're talking about removing forest, we're also talking about a computer that's very slow. There's another story I need to tell you about forests and birds. And it deals with a bird we know well, that's the barred owl. The who cooks for you, who cooks for you all. And what I want you to see is down here is a distribution map of the barred owl for North America. And I want you to notice there's a dark purple and a light purple. And so if you look at the Google map behind, can you see where that dark red, that dark green is? Basically, if you get far enough north, you can get north of that prairie zone, that pothole zone, and there's forest all the way across northern Canada. Because barred owls, we know, have to live in forest. They're not going to be found out in prairie habitat. And if you get on the west coast, then you can come down, and there's two forks. There's trees in the northern Rockies, and then there's trees along the Pacific that are the Cascades that become the Sierras. And the reason the barred owl is interesting is because it has a very close cousin out west called the spotted owl. So one is Strix varia, and the other one's Strix occidentalis. Occidentalis means western. And they look very similar. The difference is that a spotted owl is an endangered species. And it's caused a lot of foresters to wring their hands and be highly pissed off, excuse the language, but the fact is it's kept places from being logged. So these two end up having a story together. So you got to know a little bit about spotted owls. They're endangered, they're disappearing in many cases, but there's three populations. One's up in the Cascades. They're kind of a really dark chocolate. There's the Sierra ones that are just kind of straight brown, and then there's an isolated population down in southern Arizona along the Mexican border that is kind of a rust color. I've seen it in the Chiricahuas of Arizona. And if you want to say, okay, where are spotted owls found? What's their habitat? I went to eBird, found out where there's some spotted owls. I kind of knew that they used to be in the Oregon area. I wonder if they're still there. And for a reference, that blue dot is Mount Hood. And there's a little dot saying that there's spotted owl was there on territory that summer. And I circled the name Government Camp just as a reference point. So having done that, I then went to Google Earth. And I said, well, what does that habitat look like? I found Government Camp, kind of looked at the road for a reference, and I said, okay, I can zoom in and see what the habitat is for these spotted owls. And this star is where that spotted owl territory is. I've never been there. I've seen spotted owls in Oregon back in 1981. All I remember is that I had to hike up this slope that looked like you shouldn't be able to climb it. I was following one of my statistics professor who was an avid birder, and he was like 40 years older than me, and I'm panting, and he's bouncing up the mountain. And I'm going, I've been in the lab too long. But we get up in this steep slope, and there's just woods everywhere. So you can see how densely wooded that is. And believe me, that's kind of the place that if you took a wrong step, you'd probably be rolling down the mountain for a little bit. So that's good spotted owl habitat. Now then, what I want to do is I said, hey, a barred owl showed up in that area. So I went to eBird, look at the 2015 data, because I knew everybody entered everything. And there's Government Camp. I went, I'll be doggone. Barred owls that showed up at where the spotted owl, near where the spotted owl was. So then I went to the Christmas bird counts, and I said, I picked the counts that I knew. I picked up the numbers, and I said, I want to total the number of spotted owls versus barred owls for Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, because I knew that was one population. And here's what I saw. Look at this. 2000, that 114, that's 2013. And what you can see is what's been happening with barred owls. They've been dramatically going up. And look at spotted owls. They've been staying the same, and it's kind of a general downward trend. Now this explains something. And I was in Oregon in graduate school, and in 1981, I heard about the fact that, hey, we're getting barred owls here. We used to not have them. So you see this similarity, the barred owls on the right, the spotted owls on the left. The issue is the barred owl is a little bit bigger than the spotted owl. Now, I haven't done it, but I know a lot about birds of prey. It turns out red-tailed hawks kill red-shouldered hawks. All right, great horned owls kill barred owls. Barred owls eat screech owls. It's a pretty tough world out there. And so, went back and looked at what was happening in barred owls, and I'm going to read some numbers to you and point them out to show the expansion. It turned out barred owls historically were never in the western United States. They were strictly an eastern bird. But if we look at the numbers, what happens here, this says that they saw the first barred owl here in 1886, and by 1932 they spread across here. 1946 they were seen in eastern British Columbia. They then spread down the Rockies, and in 1968 they were seen in the northern Rockies. Then in 1973 the very first barred owl was seen in the state of Washington. 1974 was the very first spotted owl sighting in Oregon, and by 1981, when it showed up in California. And the concern was, are the barred owls having an impact on the spotted owls? And since if the spotted owl had not been an endangered species, nobody would have even thought of this. So let's go to Google Earth and see what's happening to the landscape here. And I want to show you, this is the Cascade Mountains where I used to go regularly. And one thing you see, it looks sort of like it has a bad sort of dermatological condition. But what we're looking at is we zoom in, is these are clear cuts. All right, these are actually, this is the way they do forestry there. They take down a whole mountainside at one time. And then they allow that hill mount to grow back up because they're cutting Douglas fir, and Douglas fir has to have sunlight. So these are entire mountain slopes. Those little white lines are roads going through the area. So zoom in. All those little white lines are logging roads. And the different shades of green are different ages of forest. It turns out spotted owls have to have old growth forest because it has to be open enough and so shady underneath that the owls can fly through the forest. Because when the trees are all, only 100 years old, they're still too close and it's still too dense in the understory for those spotted owls to work. So they have to have forests that are several hundred years old to have that open understory. This, however, is great barred owl habitat because barred owls are used to working along the edges of young forest. So this is creating a place for the barred owls to come into Oregon. And as a result, now, what that means is that barred owls are proliferating. They've discovered that barred owls chase and move spotted owls off their territory or they eat them. And so part of the management plan, the spotted owls have nowhere else to go. They've got small patches of habitat left. So now, instead of cormorants, barred owls are treated like cormorants. They are going in and killing barred owl pairs in areas where there's spotted owls just trying to keep a few oases left for these spotted owls to survive because we deforested that forest and opened up the forest to allow the barred owls to move to the west coast. Now, as we talk about changing landscapes, I just want to finish with saying, well, let's look at our area. And one of the things that's cool about Google Earth is not only can you look at it now, but there's a little bar that you can do historical. Now, historical is very relative. It's historical if you're a millennial. All right? The rest of us, it's just sort of like looking at yesterday. But, so what I did is I picked a place in Beaufort County, and I went back and, back in those really old days, like 1994, they only had black and white areas. So here's a black and white aerial of a place near Bluffton. Okay, and then I slid the time bar across. All right, and I went to 2006. Okay? So I'm not sure if you can tell any difference in that or not, but so think about how that landscape changed. This is Sun City. All right. So now, from a bird standpoint, what's that going to do? Well, that means that there are birds that were typical of grasslands and the prairies that are now finding habitat there. So actually, many of the birds that you think of as backyard birds would have never been found in dense forests. So a mockingbird, there's a loggerhead shrike, there's a northern mockingbird. Look at the original distributions of the dark color. On the bottom right, that's the native habitat of a mockingbird. A mockingbird historically would have been in Texas, Oklahoma, much like the scissortailed flycatcher. And it would have been along the barrier islands where there were sand dunes and open habitat there. That's where you would have found mockingbird habitat. Where's mockingbird habitat now? Similarly, looking at loggerhead shrikes historically were a prairie bird, and there was an isolated population in the sand ridges down the middle of Florida. They expanded when we had small-scale farming. Now they're disappearing because farming's disappearing. So people now are very concerned about the disappearance of shrikes in inland areas of the Carolinas, and I'm not really saying this loud, but guess what? Shrikes used to not be here. But they do like old-growth longleaf. So if you want to see a shrike, the one place I can still show you is to take you out to Nemours, because it turns out the other place they were found were those grasslands with the Bachman sparrows. So with that, just with my own personal experience sitting down, here's a list of birds and how they move. We've had birds move from the west to the east because of grasslands. We've had them move from the east to the west because we've taken forest out or we've planted forest. We've had them move from the north to the south. We've had them move from the south to the north. We've had them move from the tropics to the north, and we've had some come over from the old world. The mute swan came with people and accelerated. The Eurasian collared dove was brought to the Bahamas as a caged bird and got out, and then from the Bahamas it spread all the way up into Ohio. And then I've already told you that the cattle egret. So my takeaway message with you for this is think about how dynamic bird populations are, how nature abhors a void, and the ability of birds to respond to changes and sort of think about, gee, what's coming next? So with that, I'm going to end to make sure you have plenty of time to go to the bar again or dinner. And if you have any questions, then I'll try to take them as well. Thank you.